The year was 1887 when Whitecliff Orphanage was established on the craggy shores of New England. For decades, it stood as a beacon of charity and goodwill. A Victorian mansion repurposed to house children who had nowhere else to go. Most locals regarded it with a mixture of pity and pride. Pity for the unfortunate souls within its walls. Pride that their community provided for those in need. But as with many institutions left to operate without scrutiny, darkness festered behind its stone facade. My name is Thomas Blackwood, and I've spent the past 15 years as a detective with the Massachusetts State Police. What I'm about to share with you was discovered during an investigation that began in the autumn of 1956 when Whitecliff Orphanage was finally shuttered after nearly 70 years of operation. The official reason given was structural deterioration of the building. But those of us who were there know the truth. What we found in the basement of that place would haunt the dreams of even the most hardened investigator. It began with a phone call on a rainy October morning. The voice on the other end belonged to Marjorie Winters, the newly appointed director of Whitecliff. She had been brought in to oversee the closure of the orphanage and the relocation of the remaining children. Her voice trembled as she explained that workers clearing out the basement archives had discovered something disturbing. A hidden compartment behind a bookshelf containing dozens of leather-bound journals. "Detective Blackwood," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think you need to see this. Some of the entries, they're not right. Something terrible happened here." I arrived at Whitecliff the following morning. The imposing Victorian structure stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. Its weathered grey stones seeming to absorb the weak autumn sunlight rather than reflect it. Miss Winters met me at the entrance, her thin frame almost lost in the oversized coat she wore against the coastal chill. "Thank you for coming," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I've kept everything as it was found." She led me through the main hall, a cavernous space with a grand staircase that curved upward toward the dormitories. The walls were adorned with faded photographs of children. Rows upon rows of solemn faces staring back through time. A few workers moved about packing crates and dismantling furniture. The remaining 23 children had been temporarily relocated to a sister facility in the neighboring town. "While the closure proceeded you this way," Miss Winter said, leading me down a narrow corridor that ended at a heavy oak door. "The basement archives." The air grew noticeably colder as we descended the stone steps into the basement. The smell of mildew and old paper hung thick in the air. At the bottom, a long room stretched before us, lined with metal shelving units containing box after box of records. "The journals were found here," she said, pointing to a bookshelf that had been pulled away from the wall, revealing a small door built into the stonework behind it. "The maintenance man discovered it by accident when he was checking for structural damage." I crouched down to examine the hidden compartment. It was approximately 3 foot square, just large enough to contain the stack of journals that now sat on a nearby table. 37 in total, each one bound in dark leather with a number embossed in gold on the spine. "Have you read them all?" I asked. Miss Winters shook her head. "Only a few entries, enough to know that we needed to contact the authorities." I picked up the journal marked 31, the one she had specifically mentioned on the phone. The leather was cracked with age, but the pages inside were remarkably well preserved. I opened to the first entry dated September 3, 1912. September 3, 1912. "Today marks my 5th year as director of Whitecliff Orphanage. The Board of Trustees has expressed their continued satisfaction with my management, particularly regarding the reduction in operating expenses. Little do they know the true nature of these reductions. If they were to discover our arrangement with the Hargrove Society, I suspect their Christian sensibilities would be most offended. But then again, these are men who have never had to make difficult choices to ensure the survival of an institution such as this. We received 2 new children today, siblings, a boy of 7 and a girl of 5. Their parents were lost at sea, or so the story goes. The boy, William, seems bright enough, but the girl, Anna, has not spoken a word since their arrival. Dr. Lancaster believes it to be shock from the trauma. I see potential in her silence. I looked up at Miss Winters, whose face had gone pale. "The Hargrove Society. Do you know what that is?" She shook her head. I've never heard of it, but there's more. Keep reading. I turned the page. September 10th, 1912. Mr. Hargrove visited today under the pretense of a charitable donation. We discussed the new arrivals in my office while the other children were at their lessons. He expressed particular interest in Anna, commenting on her unique quality. I knew what he meant. Some children have it, others don't. That's certain something that makes them valuable to the society. Anna has it in abundance. The terms were negotiated. 6 months of operational funding in exchange for Anna when the time comes. It's a better arrangement than we usually secure. Typically, the exchange only covers 3 months of expenses, but Mr. Hargrove seemed especially keen on this one. William will pose a problem, of course. Siblings are always complicated. We'll need to separate them gradually, prepare the boy for eventual disappointment. Miss Pembroke has been instructed to begin the process, assigning them to different dormitories, scheduling their meals and lessons at alternate times. By the time the exchange occurs, William will have almost forgotten he had a sister at all. The cold of the basement seemed to intensify as I read. My fingers traced the careful script, the methodical documentation of something unspeakable. This can't be real, I muttered. Though I knew from my years of investigation that the most horrific crimes were often recorded with just such detached precision. There's an entry from March, Miss Winters said quietly. Page 76. That's the one that made me call you. I flipped through the journal until I found the date she mentioned. March, 1913. We traded Anna yesterday. The exchange took place after midnight as is customary. Mr. Hargrove arrived with 2 of his associates and the usual black carriage. No markings, no windows. Anna went quietly. We had been administering the tincture in her evening tea for the past week, so she was quite docile. William was given a stronger dose to ensure he remained asleep throughout. The funds have been deposited in the orphanage account. We should be comfortable until September, at which point we will need to assess our current inventory for the next exchange. Miss Pembroke has suggested the Thompson girl who possesses similar qualities to Anna. I'll observe her more closely in the coming weeks. Dr. Lancaster has prepared the necessary documentation showing Anna's death from scarlet fever. The small grave in the children's cemetery will contain the appropriate weight of stones and earth. William was informed this morning of his sister's passing. He wept, of course, but children are remarkably resilient. By summer, his grief will have faded to a dull memory. The Board of Trustees has approved my request for new bedding in the girls' dormitory, such as the price of running a respectable orphanage in these difficult times. My hand was shaking by the time I finished reading. Have you checked the cemetery records? I asked. Miss Winters nodded. There's a record for Anna Matthews, died March 14, 1913. Cause of death, scarlet fever. And what about William? Is there any record of what happened to him? She pulled a folder from beneath the stack of journals. I had the staff pull his file. According to the records, William Matthews was adopted by a family from Boston in October 1913, 7 months after his sister's death. There's an address listed, but it's from over 40 years ago. I closed the journal and looked at the others on the table. And these, do they all contain similar accounts? I've only skimmed a few, but yes, different children, different years, but the same pattern. Children being selected, prepared, and then traded. Always with the same clinical detachment, always with false records created to cover their disappearance. I picked up the earliest journal marked with a 1 on its spine. The first entry was dated April 1889, just 2 years after the orphanage opened. The latest journal, number 37, contained entries up to 1947. Almost 60 years, I said, feeling the weight of what that meant. If what's written here is true, this orphanage has been trafficking children for nearly 6 decades. But trafficking them where? And for what purpose? Miss Winters asked, wrapping her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. It was the question I had been avoiding. The one that lurked at the edges of my consciousness. The journals documented the selection and preparation of children, the exchanges, the cover-ups, but never explicitly stated what happened to the children after they were taken. I don't know, I admitted, but I intend to find out. I need to take these journals as evidence, and I'll need to speak with anyone who worked here during these years, especially in the 1940s when the last entries were written. Miss Winters nodded. Most of the staff from that era are gone now, either retired or deceased. But there is one, Martha Shelby. She worked as a nurse here from 1939 until just last year. She lives in town in a small cottage near the harbour. I'll need to speak with her immediately, I said, carefully gathering the journals. And in the meantime, I want the children's cemetery examined. If what these journals suggest is true, those graves may not contain what the headstones claim. The implications were almost too terrible to contemplate. How many children had disappeared into those black windowless carriages over the decades? How many false graves stood in the small cemetery on the orphanage grounds? And most importantly, what was the Hargrove Society, and what had they wanted with these children? As I packed the journals into my car, the autumn wind howled off the Atlantic, carrying with it the distant cries of seagulls. I glanced back at Whitecliff Orphanage, its stone walls and tall windows, suddenly sinister in the fading afternoon light. For nearly 70 years, it had stood as a respected institution, praised for its charitable work. Now I knew it had harbored a darkness beyond imagination. Little did I know that this was just the beginning, that the journals of Whitecliff Orphanage would lead me down a path so twisted, so steeped in horror that it would challenge not only my understanding of human depravity, but of reality itself. Martha Shelby's cottage sat at the end of a narrow lane, its weathered shingles and smoke-curling chimney, giving it the appearance of a fairy tale dwelling. But as I approached, I felt none of the comfort such an image should evoke. The journals in my briefcase seemed to grow heavier with each step. She answered after my second knock. A small woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face a map of fine wrinkles. Sharp blue eyes appraised me from behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mrs. Shelby, I'm Detective Thomas Blackwood. I was hoping I might speak with you about your time at Whitecliff Orphanage." Something flickered in those blue eyes. Recognition perhaps, or fear, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a practiced smile. "Of course, Detective, please come in. I've just put the kettle on." The interior of the cottage was meticulously kept, every surface dusted, every cushion plumped. The walls were adorned with landscape paintings and faded photographs. One caught my eye, a group portrait of staff members standing on the steps of Whitecliff, dated 1941. That was taken during the war. Mrs. Shelby said, following my gaze as she set out teacups on a small table. Times were difficult then. So many children left without families. I sat across from her, placing my briefcase on the floor beside me. "Mrs. Shelby, I'll be direct. We've discovered some disturbing documents at Whitecliff. Journals that suggest children were being removed from the orphanage under suspicious circumstances." The teacup rattled slightly in her hand before she studied it. "I'm afraid I don't know what you mean, Detective." I opened my briefcase and removed journal number 31, the one containing the entries about Anna. These journals were found hidden in the basement archives. They detail something called the Hargrove Society and describe children being traded over a period of decades. Martha Shelby's complexion went ashen. For a moment, I thought she might faint. She set down her teacup with deliberate care. "I never thought they would be found," she whispered. "They were supposed to remain hidden forever." My pulse quickened. "Then you know about them, about what happened to these children?" She nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the cottage walls. "I was young when I started at Whitecliff, just 22. The war had begun, and I wanted to do something meaningful. Caring for orphan children seemed noble." She paused, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Director Blackwood, no relation to you, I presume, was in charge then, a stern man, but respected. It was 3 months before I noticed anything unusual. Children would occasionally disappear, always with some explanation. Adopted, transferred to another facility, or tragically deceased. The paperwork was always in order. But you suspected something, I prompted. Not at first. It wasn't until I found Eliza crying in the linen closet that I began to question things. Eliza Wilson, she was one of the older girls, 14 at the time. Her younger brother, Timothy, had supposedly died of pneumonia the week before. I found her hiding, clutching a small wooden toy that had belonged to him. Martha's voice trembled slightly. She told me that Timothy hadn't been sick at all, that she had seen him the night before his death, and he had been perfectly fine. She said the director had taken a special interest in him, had him brought to his office several times in the preceding weeks. I opened the journal to an entry from November 1941. November 18, 1941. Timothy Wilson was exchanged tonight. The society paid handsomely, enough to see us through the winter and into spring. His qualities were exceptional, precisely what Mr. Hargrove has been seeking. The sister poses a risk. She asks too many questions. Nurse Shelby has been instructed to administer increased doses of sedative in the girl's evening medicine. If her suspicious nature persists, we may need to consider more permanent solutions. I looked up from the page to find Martha Shelby weeping silently. I didn't know then, she said, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief. But I started paying attention, watching, listening. There were patterns. Certain children would catch the director's eye. Usually the quiet ones, the special ones, children with unusual talents or traits. They would be given special attention for weeks or months and then they would vanish, always with some plausible explanation. And you never reported this to anyone? I asked, trying to keep the accusation from my voice. She laughed bitterly. To whom, detective? The Board of Trustees? They were complicit or at least willfully ignorant. The local police. The orphanage was the largest employer in town. Its director a respected community leader. Besides, there was never any evidence, only suspicions. What about the Hargrove Society? What do you know about them? At this, Martha Shelby rose shakily from her chair and moved to a small writing desk in the corner of the room. From a locked drawer, she withdrew a small leather-bound book, not a journal, but what appeared to be a personal diary. After Eliza's revelation, I began keeping my own record, observations, conversations overheard, names of children who disappeared. I never witnessed an exchange myself, but over time I pieced together fragments of information about the society. She handed me the diary with trembling fingers. They're old, ancient, some say, a secret organization that has existed for centuries under various names. What they want with the children, I cannot say with certainty. There were whispers among the staff. Terrible whispers. I opened the diary, scanning the neat handwriting that filled its pages. Martha had indeed been meticulous in her documentation, dates, names, circumstances of disappearance, but more disturbing were her notes on the Hargrove Society itself. December 12, 1941, overheard director speaking with Dr. Lancaster about the ritual. Mentioned something about the changing and vessels. Lancaster seemed disturbed but did not object. February 3, 1942. Cook says, black carriage came again last night. No windows, no markings, same as before. Says she once glimpsed the driver, claimed his face was not right, whatever that means. April 17, 1942. Eliza found dead this morning. Official cause, suicide by hanging, but her hands were bruised and there was a strange mark on her neck that didn't match the rope. Director ordered immediate burial. No autopsy. May 30, 1942. Groundskeeper Jenkins drunk tonight told me he's been digging empty graves for years. Just rocks and dirt, he said. When I asked where the children really went, he said only to the deep places where the old ones wait. I closed the diary, a chill running through me despite the warmth of the cottage. Mrs. Shelby, this suggests something beyond ordinary human trafficking. She nodded, her face grave. I believe the Hargrove Society is not what it seems, detective. Not simply criminals, but something else. Something older and more terrible than we can comprehend. Why didn't you leave? Why stay for all those years if you suspected such horrors? To watch, to record, to try in my small way to protect those I could. Her voice hardened. And to gather evidence, though I never found enough to bring them down. The director was careful, the society even more so. Their operations were conducted with clinical precision. I glanced back at her diary. You mentioned a groundskeeper. Jenkins. Is he still alive? Martha shook her head, found drowned in the bay in 43. Another suicide. Anyone who knew too much or spoke too freely tended to meet unfortunate ends. And the director from that period, Dr. Lancaster. Director Blackwood died in 1947. Heart attack supposedly. Dr. Lancaster left shortly after, relocated to a private practice in Boston. I lost track of him after that. I made notes of these names, determined to follow every possible lead. Mrs. Shelby, I'll need your diary as evidence, and I may have more questions as the investigation proceeds. She nodded, a certain resignation in her gesture. Take it. But be careful, detective. The society has existed for generations. They have connections in places you wouldn't expect. Government, law enforcement, judiciary. If they discover you're investigating them, I appreciate your concern, I said, rising to leave. But if what these journals describe is true, dozens, perhaps hundreds of children were taken from White Cliff over the decades. I need to find out what happened to them, no matter the risk. As I reached the door, Martha Shelby called after me. Detective, there's one more thing you should know. The exchanges followed a pattern. Always at the dark of the moon, always children with particular qualities. The staff had a name for them, the marked ones. Marked how? Not physically, at least not in any way visible to ordinary eyes. But they were different. Children who saw things others couldn't, who knew things they shouldn't. Children who spoke of dreams where they walked in places that don't exist. The director could identify them somehow. He called it the shadow on their souls. I left Martha Shelby's cottage with more questions than answers. My mind reeling from implications too bizarre to fully process. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss her more outlandish claims as the fantasies of an old woman burdened by guilt. But the journals provided tangible evidence that children had indeed been traded from White Cliff Orphanage for decades. The next morning, I contacted the state police headquarters and requested a team to investigate the children's cemetery at White Cliff. By noon, 6 officers and a forensic specialist were carefully excavating the small plot of land behind the orphanage, where generations of children had supposedly been laid to rest. It took 3 days to confirm what Martha Shelby's diary had suggested. The graves were empty, or rather, they contained no human remains, only stones and earth carefully weighted to approximate the heft of a child's body. 47 graves in total, each one a silent testament to an elaborate deception that had spanned nearly 7 decades. While the excavation proceeded, I turned my attention to tracking down any leads on the Harrow Society. The name appeared in none of the usual records, no business registrations, no property deeds, no tax filings. It was as if the organization existed only in the pages of the White Cliff journals and Martha Shelby's diary. But one name did yield results. Dr. Philip Lancaster. After leaving White Cliff in 1947, he had indeed established a private practice in Boston specializing in pediatric medicine. The practice had closed in 1962 following Lancaster's death from stroke. His widow, however, was still alive, residing in a nursing home in Cambridge. Eleanor Lancaster was 92 years old, her once sharp mind now clouded by the advance of dementia. The nursing staff warned me that her lucidity came and went, that she often confused past and present. But it was a risk I had to take. She might be the last living link to the inner workings of White Cliff during those critical years. I found her in the sunroom, a thin figure wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the day, staring out at the garden beyond the windows. Mrs. Lancaster, I'm Detective Blackwood. I'd like to ask you about your husband's work at White Cliff Orphanage. She turned slowly, rheumy eyes narrowing as she studied my face. For a moment, there was no recognition, no understanding. Then something shifted in her expression. "You found the journals," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "Philip said someone would eventually." I sat beside her, keeping my voice low. "Yes, Mrs. Lancaster. We found the journals, and we know about the children who were taken. I'm trying to understand what happened to them." A sad smile played across her withered lips. "My husband was a good man, detective, a man of science. He believed he was helping to advance human knowledge to push back the boundaries of the unknown. But in the end, he couldn't reconcile his conscience with what he had witnessed." "And what was that exactly?" Her gaze drifted back to the garden. "The society is ancient, you know. They've gone by many names throughout history. The Brotherhood of the Abyss, the Watchers at the Threshold, the Keepers of the Veil. Harrove is just their most recent incarnation." I felt a familiar skepticism rise within me. Perhaps the nursing staff had been right about her mental state. "Mrs. Lancaster, I'm interested in concrete information about what happened to the children from White Cliff." "Of course you are," she said, patting my hand with gnarled fingers. "So practical, so grounded in your perception of reality." Philip was the same at first, a man of medicine, of empirical evidence, until he saw what became of little David Peterson. The name struck a chord. I had read about David in Journal number 35, a 7-year-old boy described as having exceptional sensitivity to the unseen world. According to the entry, he had been exchanged in February 1946. "What happened to David?" I asked. "They took him to the house on Beacon Hill. That's where the initial transformations occurred. Philip was invited to observe. It was a rare honor. They told him the society typically kept their rituals private, but they wanted a medical perspective on the physical changes." She shuddered at the memory. "He came home different that night. Wouldn't speak of what he'd seen. Not at first. It took months before he told me, and even then I thought it was some kind of nervous breakdown. The things he described couldn't possibly be real." "What things, Mrs. Lancaster?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "The children were vessels, detective, preparations for something ancient to inhabit. The society believed that certain children, special children, had minds particularly receptive to hosting." "Hosting what?" I asked, though a part of me didn't want to hear the answer. "They called them the Old Ones, entities that existed before humanity, before Earth itself. Beings of immense power that exist primarily in dimensions adjacent to our own, unable to fully manifest in our reality without a suitable vessel. The society has served them for centuries, providing them with carefully prepared hosts." I fought to keep my expression neutral. The rational part of my mind dismissed her words as delusion, yet something deeper, some primal instinct, resonated with a terrible certainty. "Mrs. Lancaster, are you saying these children were possessed?" She laughed. A hollow, brittle sound. "Such a quaint term, detective. It implies something temporary, something that could be exorcised or driven out. No, this was more fundamental. A complete transformation of the vessel, body, and soul into something neither human nor entirely other. A perfect melding that allowed the Old Ones to experience our world directly. And your husband witnessed this. He witnessed the beginning of it, the initial joining. It was enough to haunt him for the rest of his life." Her fingers plucked restlessly at her shawl. "He left the society after that. Refused to participate further. We moved frequently in the years that followed, always looking over our shoulders. Philip kept journals of his own, detailed accounts of everything he had learned about the society and their practices. He wanted there to be a record in case." "In case what, Mrs. Lancaster?" "In case they succeeded," she whispered. "Their ultimate goal wasn't simply to provide vessels for individual Old Ones. It was to prepare the way for something larger. The return of all the Old Ones, the reshaping of our world into one more suitable for their existence." I leaned forward. "These journals your husband kept. Where are they now?" "Hidden. After his death, I concealed them as he instructed. The location is. She frowned, confusion clouding her features. I can't remember. It's been so long. Please, Mrs. Lancaster. It's important. Lives may depend on it. She closed her eyes, concentrating. There was a key and a storage facility in his name, but not his real name. The name he used was. Suddenly, her eyes flew open wide with fear. They're here, she hissed, clutching my arm with surprising strength. They found us. I glanced around the sunroom, seeing only other elderly residents and staff. Who's here, Mrs. Lancaster? Don't look directly at them. They'll know. Her voice was urgent, trembling. The society has eyes everywhere. People who appear human but aren't. Not anymore. They've been watching me for years, waiting for someone like you to come asking questions. A chill ran down my spine despite the rational part of my mind dismissing her paranoia. Mrs. Lancaster, we're safe here. No one is watching us. The orderly who just passed by the door, she whispered. Did you notice his eyes? How they reflect the light wrongly. And the nurse at the station, she's been there too long. Hasn't moved once since you arrived. They're Sentinels, detective, the changed ones. I humoured her, glancing casually toward the nurse's station. The woman there was indeed remarkably still, her attention seemingly fixed on her paperwork, as if sensing my gaze. She looked up suddenly, our eyes meeting across the room. For a fraction of a second, so briefly I might have imagined it. Something shifted in her face, a subtle wrongness that defied description. You need to go, Eleanor Lancaster urged. Find Philip's journals. The storage facility was in Portsmouth, Harbourview Storage, under the name Richard Marsh. The key is hidden in our old house in Boston, 1147, Commonwealth Avenue, behind the loose brick in the fireplace. If the house still stands, if the new owners haven't found it. Her voice trailed off as a nurse approached, smiling pleasantly. Time for your medication, Mrs. Lancaster. Eleanor's grip on my arm tightened. Don't trust anyone, detective. They've had decades to spread their influence. The children they took, the ones who were successfully transformed. They walk among us now, holding positions of power and authority. They look human. They act human, but they serve the old ones. The nurse's smile remained fixed as she administered Eleanor's medication. She gets quite imaginative in the afternoons, she told me. All sorts of fantastic stories. I understand, I said, rising to leave. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Lancaster. As I walked toward the exit, I glanced back. Eleanor's eyes were on me, pleading and fearful. The nurse stood beside her, one hand resting on the old woman's shoulder. As I watched, the nurse leaned down and whispered something in Eleanor's ear. Something that made the elderly woman go rigid with terror. I left the nursing home with Eleanor Lancaster's warnings echoing in my mind. The rational part of me wanted to dismiss her account as the ramblings of a dementia patient. Yet the specificity of certain details gave me pause. The storage facility in Portsmouth, the key hidden in the fireplace of her former home, these were concrete leads that could be verified. More troubling was my own reaction to the nurse at the station. Had I really seen something unusual in her face? Or was I allowing Eleanor's paranoia to influence my perception? I had been a detective long enough to trust my instincts, and something about the entire situation at White Cliff Orphanage had felt wrong from the beginning. Not just criminally wrong, but wrong in a way that challenged my understanding of reality. I decided to pursue the lead in Boston first. The Lancasters' former home on Commonwealth Avenue was my best chance of finding the key to the storage unit where Philip Lancaster had supposedly hidden his journals. The house turned out to be a stately brownstone, now divided into luxury apartments. Through a combination of official credentials and careful questioning, I learned that the original fireplace in the main living room had been preserved in what was now the ground floor apartment occupied by a young professional couple. Explaining my presence as part of a historical preservation survey, I gained access to the apartment while its owners were at work. The fireplace was indeed original to the house, an ornate marble affair with intricate carvings. I examined the interior carefully, running my fingers along the bricks until I found one that shifted slightly under pressure. With a small pocket knife, I worked the brick free. Behind it was a small cavity containing a brass key attached to a tag with faded writing. Harborview Storage, Unit 17, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Eleanor Lancaster's information had been accurate. Whatever else she might have imagined, this key was real, and with it the possibility that her husband's journals existed as well. I drove to Portsmouth that same afternoon. The coastal highway providing views of the same Atlantic waters that crashed against the cliffs below Whitecliff Orphanage. Harborview Storage turned out to be an aging facility near the docks, its salt-weathered sign barely legible. The manager, a grizzled man in his 60s, examined the key with suspicion. Unit 17's been paid up through a trust account for hell must be 30 years now. Money comes in like clockwork every January. Never seen who owns it, though. The owner was Dr. Philip Lancaster, I explained, showing my credentials. I'm investigating a case related to his former employment. Has anyone accessed this unit recently? The manager checked his records. Not according to the log. Last entry was 1962. That's when the automatic payment started. Unit 17 was located at the far end of the facility. A padlocked door of corrugated metal that had clearly not been opened in decades. The lock was stiff with disuse, requiring considerable force to turn the key. When the door finally rolled upward, it revealed a space about 10 foot square containing a single object. A large steamer trunk secured with yet another padlock. I'll need some privacy, I told the manager, who nodded and retreated to his office. The key that had opened the unit also fit the trunk's padlock. Inside, carefully packed and preserved in oilcloth, were 13 leather-bound journals, similar in appearance to those found at Whitecliff, but with PL embossed on each cover rather than a number. I opened the first journal, dated 1941, the year Philip Lancaster began working at Whitecliff Orphanage, September 15, 1941. I have accepted the position of medical officer at Whitecliff Orphanage, beginning next month. The salary is modest, but Director Blackwood has hinted at additional compensation for what he calls special research opportunities. He was vague about the nature of this research, mentioning only that it involves children with unusual neurological or psychological profiles. Given my interest in developmental psychology, this could be a fascinating opportunity. Eleanor is pleased that we'll be moving to the coast. The sea air will be good for her health, and the proximity to Boston means we won't be entirely removed from civilization. The early entries were mundane. Observations about the orphanage, the children, the staff. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone began to shift. November 3, 1941. Director Blackwood introduced me to Mr. Harrow today. An unusual man, tall, gaunt, with an accent I couldn't quite place. Eastern European, perhaps. He asked detailed questions about my medical background and seemed particularly interested in my research on childhood development. Hargrove represents a private research foundation. According to Blackwood, they provide substantial funding to the orphanage in exchange for access to certain children for study. The arrangement struck me as ethically questionable, but Blackwood assured me all proper protocols are followed. The children selected for study are those with no prospects for adoption, the older ones, or those with behavioral issues that make them unsuitable for placement with families. Still, something about Harrow unsettled me. There was a coldness in his eyes when he spoke of the children as if they were specimens rather than human beings. The entries continued in this vein, documenting Lancaster's growing unease with the arrangement between Whitecliff and the Hargrove Society. By early 1942, his suspicions had deepened. February 17, 1942. I can no longer ignore the irregularities at Whitecliff. Children selected for the Hargrove Foundation studies invariably disappear within months. The official records show adoptions or transfers to other facilities, but my inquiries to these supposed destinations have been met with confusion or denial. When I questioned Director Blackwood about the discrepancies, he became defensive, reminding me of the confidentiality agreement I signed upon employment. The Foundation's work is sensitive, he said, for the greater good of humanity. Sometimes discretion requires creative documentation. I've begun keeping track of the children who catch Hargrove's attention. They share certain traits: unusual perceptiveness, vivid imaginations, what some might call sensitivity to the supernatural. Timothy Wilson was one such child. His sister's accusations of foul play were dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind, but I'm no longer certain they should have been. The journal entries grew increasingly disturbing as Lancaster documented his observations. He described midnight meetings in the director's office, strange chanting heard from the basement, children who spoke of visitors in their dreams, visitors who promised to take them to the deep places where they would be transformed. Then came the entry that changed everything. February 23, 1946. Tonight, I witnessed something that has shattered my understanding of reality. After months of cautious investigation, I managed to follow Hargrove and his associates after they removed David Peterson from the orphanage. They took him to a mansion on Beacon Hill, an imposing structure of dark stone that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Using medical credentials and implying I had been invited, I gained entry to the house. The interior was opulent but strangely proportioned. Ceilings too high. Doorways slightly wider than necessary. Angles that seemed to bend in ways that disoriented the eye. In the basement, I found a gathering of robed figures surrounding a central altar where David lay. The boy was conscious but eerily calm, his eyes fixed on the ceiling above, which had been painted with a mural of swirling stars and strange geometries that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Hargrove led the ceremony, speaking in a language I've never heard, guttural and rhythmic with consonants that no human throat should be able to produce. As the chanting intensified, the air in the room grew heavy, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. Then it appeared, a shimmering in the air above David, a distortion that gradually took form. I cannot adequately describe what I saw. It was both present and not present. A suggestion of something vast compressed into a space too small to contain it. Tendrils of opalescent light extended from the shimmering mass toward the boy. When they made contact with his skin, David's body arched upward, hovering inches above the altar. His mouth opened in what should have been a scream, but no sound emerged. Instead, the shimmering entity seemed to flow into him through his eyes, his mouth, his very pores. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. David's features shifted subtly, rearranging themselves into something that resembled him, but was fundamentally wrong. When his eyes opened again, they were not the eyes of a 7-year-old boy. Whatever looked out through those orbs was ancient beyond comprehension. Hargrove approached the altar and bowed deeply. "Welcome, honored one," he said. "Your vessel has been prepared as promised." And the thing that had been David Peterson sat up, movements jerky and uncoordinated, as if learning to operate unfamiliar machinery. When it spoke, the voice was a dissonant blend of child and something else, something that made the air vibrate painfully. "This vessel is acceptable," it said. "The alignment approaches. Prepare the next." I fled then, unable to bear witnessing more. By some miracle, my absence went unnoticed amidst the society's rapturous attention to their guest. What I have seen cannot be explained by any medical or scientific framework I know. Either I have gone mad or there exists alongside our reality something ancient and utterly alien. Something that views humanity as nothing more than potential vessels for habitation. I cannot continue my association with Whitecliff. I will tender my resignation tomorrow. Citing personal reasons, Eleanor, and I will leave this place, but I fear the knowledge I now possess will follow me wherever I go. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The account matched eerily with Eleanor Lancaster's fragmented explanations. Children used as vessels for entities she had called the Old Ones. The clinical precision of Lancaster's writing lent a terrible credibility to what would otherwise seem like the ravings of a madman. The remaining journals documented Lancaster's life after leaving Whitecliff. His paranoia, his conviction that the Hargrove Society was watching him. His research into similar organizations throughout history. The final journal dated 1962 contained a chilling entry written just days before his death, April 12, 1962. "They have found me. After 15 years of caution, of constantly looking over my shoulder, my vigilance has faltered. Yesterday I encountered David Peterson, or the thing that wears his form, at the hospital. He would be 23 now, but he is not aged normally. His appearance is that of a man in his 30s, distinguished, commanding. He recognized me immediately, those ancient eyes lighting with amusement. "Dr. Lancaster," he said, extending a hand that I could not bring myself to touch. "How remarkable to see you again after all these years." He is a surgeon now, specializing in neurology. The irony is not lost on me. A creature from beyond our reality, wearing a human skin, cutting into human brains. What knowledge does it seek? What preparations is it making? He had mentioned that the society has been expanding its influence, placing its transformed members in positions throughout government, academia, medicine. The alignment approaches, it said, echoing the words I heard in that basement 16 years ago. The stars will soon be right. I believe they will come for me soon. This journal and the others must be preserved. The world must know what walks among us wearing human faces but serving inhuman masters. If anyone finds these records, the process is not complete. The society continues its work preparing vessels for what they call the Great Return. They believe that when sufficient vessels have been prepared, when enough of the old ones walk in human form, a critical threshold will be reached, allowing for a full manifestation. God help us all if they succeed. The last page contained a hastily scrolled note in different handwriting, presumably Eleanor's. "Philip died this morning. The official cause is stroke, but I know better. They have silenced him at last. I will hide these journals as he instructed and continue moving, staying one step ahead of their reach for as long as I can. May whoever finds this record use it to stop what is coming." I sat in the storage unit for a long time, surrounded by the dusty silence, trying to process what I had read. The rational part of my mind struggled against accepting such an outlandish narrative. Secret societies, ancient entities from beyond our reality, children transformed into vessels for inhuman consciousnesses. Yet the evidence was compelling. The meticulous records kept at Whitecliff spanning nearly 70 years, the empty graves in the Orphanage cemetery, Lancaster's detailed account of what he had witnessed, and my own unsettling encounter with the nurse at Eleanor's nursing home. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the storage facility, I carefully repacked the journals in the trunk. Whatever the full truth might be, I knew I could not ignore what I had discovered. Whether the Hargrove Society was engaged in some elaborate delusion or something far more terrifying, children had disappeared from Whitecliff Orphanage for decades, and someone needed to be held accountable. I returned to my motel room that evening, my mind racing with questions and possibilities. Sleep eluded me as I pored over my notes, trying to find a rational framework for what Lancaster had described. Perhaps the society was a cult, its rituals designed to induce hallucinations or hypnotic states. Perhaps the children had been subjected to experimental drugs or psychological conditioning that made them believe they were being transformed. But such explanations felt inadequate in the face of Lancaster's clinical descriptions and the systematic nature of the exchanges documented in the Whitecliff journals. A knock at my door startled me from my thoughts. It was past midnight, too late for housekeeping or any legitimate visitor. Cautiously, I approached the door, one hand on my service weapon. "Who is it?" I called. "Detective Blackwood." "It's Martha Shelby. I need to speak with you urgently." I opened the door to find the former nurse looking even more frail than when I'd last seen her. Her face drawn with fear. "Mrs. Shelby, how did you know where to find me?" "There isn't time to explain," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder at the empty parking lot. "May I come in?" I stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She moved to the window immediately, pulling the curtains closed. "They know you've been investigating," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was visited this afternoon by a man claiming to be from the State Historical Society. Interested in my memories of Whitecliff," he said. "But his questions were all about you. What you'd asked, what I'd told you. Did you give him any information?" She shook her head. "I've learned caution over the years." But as he was leaving, I saw him meet two others in a car park down the street. One of them was Dr. Robert Hargrove. The name sent a jolt through me. Hargrove, a relative of the Society's founder, his grandson. I believe he took over leadership in the early 1950s. I recognized him from newspaper photographs. He's a prominent philanthropist now, funds medical research and children's charities. The irony was almost too perfect. A man who traffics in children, positioning himself as their benefactor. Martha nodded grimly. The Society has always operated behind a facade of respectability. Their public faces are beyond reproach. Doctors, judges, politicians. It's how they've remained untouchable for so long. I found Philip Lancaster's journals today, I told her. They confirm much of what you suggested about the Society, but they also contain claims that are difficult to accept about the nature of the exchanges. What happens to the children afterward? When I nodded, she continued, I never witnessed the rituals myself, but I heard things over the years, whispers among the staff, fragments of conversations not meant for my ears, enough to piece together a horrible truth that the children were used as vessels for entities from another reality. I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. Martha Shelby's expression remained grave. I understand your reluctance, detective. I struggled with it myself for years. But I've seen the aftermath. Children returned to the orphanage after failing the preparation process. They were never the same. Hollow-eyed, speaking in riddles about the deep places and the ones who wait beyond the stars. Most died within weeks, their minds and bodies simply giving out. Returned. The journals never mentioned failures being returned. It was rare. Perhaps 1 in 20 selected children proved unsuitable as vessels. The records of their returns were kept separate from the main journals in what the director called the Failed Vessel Archive. I don't know if those documents were among those you found. They hadn't been, which meant there was potentially more evidence still hidden at White Cliff. Evidence that might provide further insights into the Society's practices. Mrs. Shelby, we need to go to the authorities with this information. The state police, the FBI, she laughed bitterly. And tell them what exactly? That an orphanage has been trafficking children to serve as vessels for interdimensional entities. That prominent citizens across New England are not human at all, but ancient beings wearing human forms. They dismiss it as the ravings of a senile old woman and a detective who's lost his grip on reality. She had a point. Without concrete evidence of crimes that fell within conventional understanding, law enforcement would be unlikely to take action. And even if they did, Martha's warnings about the Society's influence in those very institutions gave me pause. Then what do you suggest? We can't simply do nothing. Martha reached into her handbag and withdrew a folded piece of paper. There are others who know about the Society, people who have been monitoring their activities for decades. This is the address of someone who can help you understand what you're facing and how to proceed. The paper contained an address in Providence, Rhode Island, and a name, Elijah Ward, Department of Anthropology, Miskatonic University. Professor Ward has spent his career studying organizations like the Harrow Society, cults, and secret orders that worship entities from beyond our reality. His grandfather was involved in exposing a similar group in Massachusetts back in the 1920s. I pocketed the address, my skepticism wavering in the face of Martha's evident sincerity. I'll contact him tomorrow. In the meantime, you should stay somewhere safe. If the Society suspects you've been helping me, I've made my arrangements, detective. I've lived with this knowledge for too long to be careless now. She rose to leave, then hesitated at the door. Be vigilant. The Society's reach is long, and those who've been changed, they don't think like humans anymore. They perceive reality differently, operate according to priorities we can barely comprehend. After Martha left, I spent another hour reviewing my notes, adding what she had told me about the Failed Vessel Archive and the current leadership of the Society. Eventually, exhaustion overcame me, and I fell into a troubled sleep filled with dreams of children with ancient eyes and corridors that bent at impossible angles. I awoke at dawn, determined to pursue 2 parallel paths, contacting Professor Ward and Providence and returning to White Cliff to search for the additional records Martha had mentioned. The orphanage was scheduled for demolition in less than a week. If the failed vessel archive existed, I needed to find it before the building came down. As I packed my car, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street, its windows tinted to opacity. It hadn't been there the previous evening. Pretending not to notice, I continued loading my briefcase and overnight bag, but a prickle of unease ran down my spine. Martha's warnings about being watched suddenly seemed less paranoid. The sedan remained in place as I pulled out of the motel parking lot. In my rear-view mirror, I saw it ease into traffic, several cars behind me, maintaining distance, but definitely following. I took a series of random turns through the small coastal town, confirming my suspicion when the sedan continued to mirror my movements. Rather than heading directly to White Cliff or Providence, I drove to the local police station. The sedan didn't follow me into the parking lot. Instead, cruising past and disappearing around a corner. Inside, I introduced myself to the chief, a weathered man named Sullivan, who had served in the department for over 30 years. "Of course, I remember White Cliff," he said when I explained my investigation. "Strange place, always kept to itself. Folks in town didn't ask too many questions. The orphanage provided jobs, donations to local causes, made itself useful enough that people looked the other way when things seemed odd." "Odd in what way?" I asked. Sullivan shrugged. "Deliveries at strange hours. Children who disappeared without notice. Always explained away, of course. And there were rumors about the directors over the years that they had connections in high places, that crossing them would bring trouble." "Did your department ever investigate any complaints about White Cliff?" "A few times early in my career, missing children reports that traced back there, usually filed by relatives who suddenly appeared after years of absence. But the paperwork at the orphanage was always in order. Death certificates, transfer records, adoption papers." He frowned, rubbing his chin. Looking back, it was too perfect. No institution handles that much paperwork without occasional errors. But White Cliff's records were immaculate. "What about the Hargrove family? Do you know anything about them?" At this, Sullivan's expression grew guarded. "Old money, very influential. The current Dr. Harrove sits on half the charitable boards in New England, donates to all the right political campaigns." "Why do you ask?" I decided to be cautious. "His name appeared in some of the orphanage records. I'm trying to establish the connection." Sullivan nodded, but his eyes had grown wary. "Well, I wish you luck with your investigation, detective, but a word of advice. Tread carefully when it comes to families like the Harroves. They've been around a long time, know a lot of important people." As I left the station, I noted that Sullivan immediately picked up his phone, watching me through the window as he spoke to someone on the other end. The black sedan was nowhere in sight, but I felt eyes on me nonetheless. I decided to change my plans. White Cliff could wait. I needed to speak with Professor Ward first to better understand what I might be facing. I headed south toward Providence, taking back roads and frequently checking my rear-view mirror for signs of pursuit. Miskatonic University turned out to be a small but prestigious institution nestled among the historic buildings of Providence's College Hill. The Department of Anthropology occupied a Victorian mansion converted to academic use. Its interior, a labyrinth of book-lined offices and cluttered research spaces. Professor Elijah Ward's office was on the third floor, a corner room with tall windows overlooking the campus quad. The man himself was younger than I had expected, perhaps 45, with prematurely silver hair and intense grey eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. His office walls were covered with maps marked with colored pins, shelves overflowing with ancient-looking artifacts from various cultures. "Detective Blackwood," he said, rising to shake my hand. "Martha Shelby telephoned this morning to say you might be coming. Please sit down." I took the offered chair, noting the open notebook on his desk filled with cramped handwriting and strange symbols. "Mrs. Shelby said, you're an expert on organizations like the Hargrove Society." I began. Ward nodded, his expression grave. "I've spent my career studying what I call threshold cults, groups dedicated to facilitating contact between our reality and others. The Hargrove Society is one of the oldest and most sophisticated of these organizations. Then you believe their claims about entities from beyond our reality? He smiled thinly. What I believe is less important than what they believe, detective. But I will say this, there are phenomena in this world that resist conventional explanation, patterns that recur across cultures and throughout history that suggest humanity has encountered something beyond itself. He rose and moved to a large map on the wall covered with red pins. These mark locations where threshold cults have been active over the past century. Note the concentration in coastal New England, particularly around deep harbor cities. The Hargrove Society operates primarily in this region, though they have branches elsewhere. I studied the map, noting that White Cliff Orphanage location was indeed marked with a red pin. What exactly do these organizations do? Mrs. Shelby and the journals I found suggest they're preparing vessels for entities they call the Old Ones. Ward returned to his desk, steepling his fingers. The terminology varies. The Old Ones, the Deep Dwellers, those from beyond, but the concept remains consistent across these groups. They believe that certain beings exist in dimensions adjacent to our own, entities of immense power and intelligence that predate humanity by eons. These beings cannot fully manifest in our reality without suitable vessels. Humans who have been specially prepared to host their consciousness. And the children from White Cliff, they were these vessels. Children are particularly valued for this purpose. Ward confirmed. Their developing minds are more adaptable, more receptive to the necessary changes. Adults tend to resist the transformation. Their identities too firmly established to accommodate the intrusion of another consciousness. I thought of the entries in journal number 31 about Anna, how she had been selected for her unique quality, her silence interpreted as potential receptivity. The journals describe a Hargrove Society that's existed for generations, trafficking children from this orphanage. Are you saying this has been happening for centuries? Ward nodded solemnly. The society itself dates back to at least the 1700s, though it operated under different names before that. Their fundamental purpose has remained consistent: to serve as intermediaries between our world and the Old Ones, facilitating the gradual infiltration of our reality. To what end? According to their belief system, our universe is merely a temporary aberration, a bubble of order in a much vaster cosmos of chaos. The Old Ones seek to restore what they consider the natural state, a reality reshaped according to their nature, where the laws of physics and biology, as we understand them, no longer apply. The implications were staggering and nearly impossible to accept. Yet, the evidence I had gathered pointed to something beyond ordinary human criminality. Professor Ward, I need to know how to stop them. If what you're saying is true, if children are still being transformed, for this purpose, it has to end. Ward's expression grew somber. Detective, you need to understand the scale of what you're confronting. The Hargrove Society isn't some small cult operating on the fringes of society. They've had centuries to accumulate wealth, influence, and power. Their transformed vessels, the successfully merged consciousnesses, now occupy positions throughout government, academia, business, law enforcement. They look human. They can pass as human, but their allegiance is to the Old Ones. Then what can we do? Stand by and allow more children to be sacrificed? Of course not. But direct confrontation would be suicide, both literally and in terms of your reputation and career. The society would simply discredit you. Or worse. He leaned forward, his voice lowering. What we need is evidence that can't be disputed or covered up. Something that would expose their activities in terms that even the most skeptical authorities couldn't ignore. The journals are a start, but not enough. They could be dismissed as the elaborate fantasy of a disturbed mind. We need physical evidence of the crimes, ideally the testimony of surviving victims. The failed vessel archive, I said, remembering Martha's information. Records of children who were returned to the orphanage after the transformation process failed. Mrs. Shelby mentioned they might still be hidden at White Cliff. Ward's eyes lit with interest. That could be invaluable. Medical records documenting physical and psychological changes in the children would be difficult to dismiss, especially if corroborated by the journals. The orphanage is scheduled for demolition in 5 days. If those records exist, I need to find them before the building comes down. I'll come with you, Ward said, rising from his desk. My expertise might help identify what we're looking for, and frankly, Detective, you shouldn't face this alone. The society has ways of influencing those who get too close to their secrets. Having someone who understands their methods could make the difference. I hesitated, unsure whether to involve a civilian in what was becoming an increasingly dangerous investigation. But Ward's knowledge of the society and its practices could indeed prove invaluable. We'll leave tomorrow morning, I decided. In the meantime, I'd like to learn more about what we're facing, how to recognize these transformed individuals, how to protect ourselves from their influence. Ward nodded gravely. I have materials that might help. But first, Detective, you should know that by pursuing this investigation, you've already drawn their attention. The society has ways of knowing when someone gets too close to their secrets. From this point forward, you need to assume you're being watched. His words sent a chill down my spine, reminding me of the black sedan outside my motel and Chief Sullivan's suspicious reaction to my questions. Is there anything I can do to protect myself? Ward moved to a cabinet and unlocked it, revealing shelves of strange objects. Amulets, crystals, small vials of liquid. He selected a silver pendant on a chain inscribed with symbols I didn't recognize. Threshold entities perceive reality differently than humans. They sense energy patterns, particularly those associated with consciousness. This won't hide you completely, but it may blur your signature, make you harder to track. He handed me the pendant. Keep it with you at all times. I took the amulet, feeling slightly foolish, but unwilling to dismiss anything that might help. And how do I identify them? The transformed ones. It's not easy. They've had decades, sometimes centuries, to perfect their human disguises. But there are tells if you know what to look for. Their movements can be subtly wrong, too fluid or too rigid, as if they're still learning to operate human musculature. Their emotional responses often don't quite match the situations they're in. Laughing at tragedy, remaining impassive during moments of joy. He moved to his desk and retrieved a small leather case. But the most reliable indicator is their reaction to certain substances. He opened the case to reveal several glass vials containing a pale blue powder. This is a compound derived from a rare fungus found in the deep Pacific. The old ones have a profound aversion to it. Proximity causes them discomfort. Direct contact forces a momentary lapse in their human disguise. I took the case. Skepticism warring with the growing conviction that I was dealing with something beyond conventional understanding. And if I encounter one of them, what then? Ward's expression was grim. Avoid confrontation if possible. Their physical capabilities often exceed human norms and they perceive threats before they're manifest if confrontation is unavoidable. He hesitated. There are methods to temporarily disrupt the merged consciousness to drive the non-human component back long enough to escape, but true separation is nearly impossible once the transformation is complete. As we finalized our plans for the journey to Whitecliff the following day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a threshold in my own understanding of reality. That the world I had known, governed by rational laws and familiar limitations, was merely a veneer concealing something vastly more complex and terrifying. That night, in the small hotel room I'd checked into under a false name, I dreamed of Anna, the silent 5-year-old described in journal number 31. In the dream, she stood at the end of a long corridor, her back to me. When I called her name, she turned slowly, revealing a face that shifted between that of a child and something ancient and inhuman. Eyes that held the cold emptiness of deep space. "They're coming for you," she said, her voice a discordant blend of child and other. "They know you found the journals. They know you've spoken to the professor. There's nowhere in this reality you can hide from them." I awoke in a cold sweat, the memory of those alien eyes lingering in my mind. Outside my window, the first light of dawn was breaking over Providence, painting the historic buildings in hues of gold and amber. For a moment, the beauty of the scene almost convinced me that the horrors I had uncovered were nothing more than an elaborate nightmare. But the journals were real. The empty graves at Whitecliff were real. And whatever the full truth might be about the Harrow Society and the entities they served, children had disappeared for decades under their influence. As I prepared to meet Professor Ward for our journey to Whitecliff, I made a silent promise to Anna and all the others who had been taken. I would find the truth and I would make sure it was heard. No matter the cost, no matter the risk to my career or my understanding of reality, what awaited us at Whitecliff Orphanage would test that resolve beyond anything I could have imagined. Professor Ward and I arrived at Whitecliff just after noon. The orphanage stood silent against the grey autumn sky, its windows dark and empty. A chain-link fence had been erected around the perimeter, marked with demolition zone signs, but the main gate was unlocked. The demolition crew was not due to begin work for another 4 days. "It's larger than I expected," Ward remarked as we approached the main entrance. "How many children lived here at its peak?" "According to the records, around 120 during the 1920s, I replied. By the time it closed, that number had dwindled to 23. The front door was secured with a padlock, but as a detective investigating the orphanage closure, I had been provided with keys by the state authorities. The heavy oak door creaked open, revealing the grand entrance hall I had visited with Miss Winters when the investigation began. Now, with the building completely empty, the silence was oppressive, a weight of accumulated history and secrets pressing down on us. "Where was the basement archive located?" Ward asked, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. I led him through the main hall, past the grand staircase, and down the narrow corridor to the heavy door that opened onto the basement steps. The air grew noticeably colder as we descended, carrying the same smell of mildew and old paper I had noticed on my first visit. The basement archives looked much as they had before. Rows of metal shelving units filled with boxes and files. The bookshelf that had concealed the hidden compartment still pulled away from the wall. But something felt different. A subtle disturbance in the dust. Footprints that hadn't been there during my previous visit. "Someone's been here," I said quietly, drawing my service weapon. "Recently," Ward nodded, his expression tense. The society would have moved quickly once they realized the journals had been discovered. If there was other evidence hidden here. We moved cautiously through the archive room, checking each row of shelving. Near the back wall, we found clear signs of disturbance. Several boxes had been emptied, their contents missing. A metal filing cabinet stood open, its drawers bare. "They've cleared it out," I said, frustration mounting. "Whatever was here, they've taken it." Ward knelt beside an overturned box, examining the few papers that remained scattered on the floor. "Not everything, perhaps. Look at this." He handed me a yellowed page that appeared to have been torn from a larger document. It contained a list of names, children's names with dates and cryptic annotations. Emily Thornton, 101744. Stage 2 rejection, cognitive deterioration. Michael Harris, 020345. Stage 3 rejection, physical mutation contained. Sarah Pierce, 05 or 3045. Complete rejection terminal. "The failed vessel archive," I murmured. "Or part of it, at least. They must have missed this page when they were removing the files." Ward nodded, continuing to search through the scattered papers. "Even fragments could be valuable. These annotations suggest detailed medical documentation of the failed transformations. Exactly the kind of evidence we need." We spent the next hour meticulously examining the basement archives, gathering every scrap of paper that might have been overlooked in the Society's hasty removal of evidence. In total, we found 7 pages from what appeared to be the failed vessel archive, each containing similar lists of names with clinical annotations describing failed transformations. "It's not much," I said, carefully storing the pages in my briefcase. "But it corroborates what we found in the journals. Children being subjected to some kind of procedure that could result in rejection and death. There might be more." Ward suggested the society would have focused on the obvious locations, the archives, the director's office. But in a building this size, there could be other hiding places they overlooked. He was right. We needed to search the entire orphanage. A daunting task given its size, but necessary if we wanted to gather enough evidence to expose the society's activities. We began with the administrative section, the director's office, the staff quarters, the infirmary. Each room had been largely cleared out during the orphanage closure, but we searched meticulously, checking for hidden compartments, loose floorboards, anything that might conceal documents or other evidence. In the infirmary, behind a radiator that had been partially detached from the wall, we found a small leather pouch containing several glass vials. Each contained a different substance: powders, liquids, what appeared to be dried herbs, preparation materials, Ward said after examining the vials, compounds used to make the children more receptive to the transformation process. This is significant physical evidence of non-standard medical treatments being administered to the children. We continued our search through the dormitories, large austere rooms with rows of iron bed frames now stripped of mattresses and bedding. In one of the girls' dormitories, beneath a loose floorboard, we discovered a child's diary, small with a faded floral cover. The name inside read Elizabeth Wilson, 1941. Eliza, I said, remembering Martha Shelby's account, the girl who questioned her brother's disappearance. The diary contained the observations of a bright, perceptive 14-year-old documenting daily life at the orphanage. But as I flipped through the pages, the entries took a darker turn. October 3, 1941. Timothy was called to the director's office again today. It's the third time this week. When he came back, he seemed different, quieter, his eyes sort of glazed. When I asked what they wanted, he just shook his head and said the director had asked him questions about his dreams. The same thing happened to Anna Miller last year before she died. They said it was scarlet fever. But I saw her the night before and she was fine. Not even a sniffle. And now they're doing it to Timothy. Something is wrong here. The other children don't see it or don't want to see it. But I've been watching. Children disappear all the time. Adopted, transferred, died of illness. Always the quiet ones, the dreamers, the ones who see things others don't. The final entry was dated November 19, 1941, one day after Timothy's exchange, as documented in the White Cliff Journal. They told me Timothy died last night. Pneumonia, they said, but I know he wasn't sick. I saw him yesterday evening and he was fine. Scared, but not sick. I tried to tell Nurse Shelby, but she gave me medicine that made me sleepy. I think they're going to do something to me, too. I've hidden this diary where they won't find it. If anyone reads this, children are disappearing from White Cliff. They're not dying or being adopted. Something else is happening. Please help us. The diary ended there. Eliza's final plea preserved for over 15 years beneath the floorboards of the dormitory. According to Martha Shelby's account, Eliza herself had been found dead. Another suicide just months later. This is powerful testimony, Ward said quietly. A contemporaneous account from a child witnessing the society's activities, corroborating everything we've learned from the journals and Martha Shelby's recollections. We continued our search, moving methodically through the orphanage. In the kitchen, behind a loose brick in the massive fireplace, we found a small metal box containing several photographs, children standing in groups on the orphanage steps. Staff members posed formally for what appeared to be annual portraits. One photograph in particular caught my attention. A group of men in formal attire, standing on the steps of an imposing mansion. The back of the photograph was labeled Hargrove Society Annual Gathering, 1937. I recognized none of the faces, but Ward studied it intently. This is significant, he said. Photographic evidence linking specific individuals to the society. Some of these men held prominent positions: judges, politicians, business leaders. This helps establish the society's influence and reach. By late afternoon, we had searched most of the main building, gathering what evidence we could find. Fragments of records, personal items, photographs. It wasn't as comprehensive as the failed vessel archive might have been, but together with the journals, it painted a compelling picture of decades of systematic child trafficking under the guise of charitable work. There's one place we haven't checked, I said as the daylight began to fade. The children's cemetery, Ward nodded grimly. If the society was thorough in removing evidence from the building, they may have overlooked the cemetery. It's worth examining. The small plot of land behind the orphanage contained 47 headstones arranged in neat rows. The excavation had confirmed that the graves contained no human remains, but we had not thoroughly examined the headstones themselves or the surrounding area. As twilight deepened, we moved among the small markers, studying each one. They were simple granite slabs, each bearing a name, dates of birth and death, and the same epitaph. In God's care, nothing unusual stood out until we reached the far corner of the cemetery, where a larger monument stood slightly apart from the others. It was an angel statue weathered by decades of coastal storms. Its features eroded almost beyond recognition. At its base, a plaque read in memory of all children of White Cliff, known and unknown. 1887, 1956. Check the base, Ward suggested. Monuments like this often have hollow compartments, time capsules, or repositories for memorial items. I knelt and examined the stone base carefully. On one side, I noticed a section where the granite seemed slightly different in color and texture. Pressing against it, I felt it give slightly. With more pressure, the panel slid inward, revealing a small cavity containing a metal cylinder. Inside the cylinder was a roll of papers. Architectural drawings of White Cliff Orphanage dated 1886. But these weren't ordinary blueprints. In addition to the standard rooms and features, they showed hidden passages, concealed chambers, and most significantly, a sub-level that wasn't included in the official plans I had reviewed during the investigation. My God, I breathed, studying the drawings by the beam of my flashlight. There's an entire level beneath the basement archives. According to this, it's accessible through a concealed door in the northeast corner. Ward examined the plans, his expression grim. This would be the perfect location for conducting the rituals and transformations. Isolated, soundproof, unknown to casual visitors or inspectors. We hurried back to the main building, our flashlight beams casting long shadows through the darkening halls. In the basement archives, we moved to the northeast corner where the blueprints indicated the hidden entrance should be. The wall appeared solid, rows of shelving units filled with boxes and files. But according to the plans, behind one of these units was a concealed door leading to a staircase that descended to the sub. This one, Ward said, pointing to a shelving unit that matched the location on the blueprints. It should pivot outward if we find the mechanism. We examined the shelving unit carefully, checking for hidden levers or switches. Finally, behind a row of dusty ledgers, I found a small metal plate that yielded to pressure. With a grinding sound of long disused machinery, the entire shelving unit pivoted outward, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into darkness. The air that rose from the opening was cold and stale, carrying a faint odor I couldn't immediately identify. Something chemical mixed with a musty organic scent. We should proceed with caution, Ward warned, producing a small flashlight of his own. If this is where the society conducted their rituals, there may be remnants of their work. The stairs descended for about 20 feet before opening into a large circular chamber carved directly into the bedrock beneath the orphanage. Our flashlight beams revealed walls inscribed with strange symbols and formulae, a stone altar in the center of the room, and various apparatus arranged around the perimeter, glass vessels, metal instruments, what appeared to be medical equipment from different eras. "This is it," Ward whispered, his voice tinged with awe and horror. The transformation chamber where children were prepared as vessels for the old ones. I moved cautiously around the room, documenting everything with the camera I had brought. The altar was stained with what might have been chemicals or blood and fitted with restraints sized for a child. The instruments arranged nearby seemed to be a grotesque hybrid of medical equipment and ceremonial objects. Scalpels inscribed with arcane symbols. Hypodermic needles mounted in ornate holders. Glass vessels etched with geometric patterns that hurt the eyes to look at directly. "Over here," Ward called from the far side of the chamber. "Files." They missed them. He had found a metal cabinet built into the wall containing dozens of folders. Each bore a child's name, dates, and a series of annotations similar to those we had found in the fragments of the failed vessel archive. But these weren't records of failures. They were detailed documentation of successful transformations, complete with photographs, medical observations, and transcripts of interviews conducted before and after the procedures. The photographs were the most disturbing. Children photographed at regular intervals throughout the preparation process. Their expressions gradually changing from fear or confusion to something else entirely, a cold alien awareness that transformed their features into masks of inhuman intelligence. "This is beyond anything I imagined," Ward said, his voice shaking as he examined the files. They documented everything: the chemicals administered, the rituals performed, the gradual surrender of the human consciousness, and the emergence of the other. I opened one of the folders at random. A girl named Sophia Curtis, age 7, prepared in 1923. The file contained detailed notes on her selection, exceptional sensitivity to non-visible spectrum, reported conversations with voices from the sea, her preparation, standard regimen of tinctures and hypnotic conditioning accelerated due to unusual receptivity, and the transformation itself. Complete integration achieved in 17 days. Among the most efficient recorded. The final page contained a photograph taken 3 months after the transformation. Sophia, dressed formally, standing beside a distinguished-looking man identified as her guardian. But the child in the photograph was not truly Sophia anymore. Though her features were the same, the eyes that gazed at the camera held an awareness that was ancient and utterly inhuman. A notation at the bottom of the page indicated that Vessel Sophia had been placed with a prominent Boston family. Her education to be supervised by society members in preparation for eventual position in diplomatic service. They infiltrated them everywhere, I said. The horror of it finally sinking in. Government, academia, medicine, positions of influence where they could further the society's goals. Ward nodded grimly, and each successful vessel would have aged normally, lived out a human lifespan, though potentially longer than average, while the consciousness within it pursued the agenda of the old ones. Over decades, their numbers would have grown, their influence spread. We gathered as many of the files as we could carry, knowing they represented the most compelling evidence yet of the society's activities. As we prepared to leave the transformation chamber, Ward paused, his attention caught by something carved into the stone floor near the altar. It was a large symbol, a spiral pattern that seemed to fold in upon itself in ways that defied ordinary geometry. Around its perimeter were inscribed words in a language I didn't recognize. "What is it?" I asked. "A threshold mark," Ward replied, his voice hushed. "A point of contact between realities. This is where the entities would begin to manifest during the transformation rituals." He studied the inscription. The text is in Aliahian, the language of the Old Ones as recorded in various ancient texts. It says, roughly translated, "The way is prepared. The vessels await. When the stars align, we shall return in fullness." A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold air of the underground chamber. Return in fullness? What does that mean? According to threshold cult beliefs, the entities that have been using human vessels are merely fragments, splinters of the greater consciousnesses that exist beyond our reality. The ultimate goal is to enable a complete manifestation, the full emergence of the Old Ones into our world, and these children, these vessels, their preparation for that, part of some larger plan. Ward nodded solemnly. Each successful transformation strengthens the connection between realities, makes the boundary more permeable. If enough vessels were created, spread throughout positions of influence. He didn't need to finish the thought. The implications were clear and terrifying. We left the transformation chamber, carefully concealing the entrance behind us. With our gathered evidence, the fragments of the failed vessel archive, Eliza's diary, the photographs, and most significantly, the files from the sub, we had what we needed to expose the Hargrove Society's activities. But as we emerged from the orphanage into the night air, I was acutely aware that our discovery placed us in grave danger. If the society had connections in government, law enforcement, and other institutions, bringing this evidence to the authorities would be risky, potentially fatal. "We need to make copies," I told Ward as we loaded our findings into my car. "Multiple sets hidden in different locations, and we need to identify trusted individuals in various organizations who can receive and act on this information." Ward agreed. "I have colleagues at universities in different states, people who have studied threshold phenomena and would recognize the significance of what we found. And there are journalists who specialize in investigating institutional corruption, who might be willing to publish, regardless of pressure. As we drove away from White Cliff Orphanage for what I hoped would be the final time, I glanced in the rear-view mirror at the looming Victorian structure silhouetted against the night sky. For nearly 70 years, it had stood as a facade of charity, concealing unimaginable horrors. In less than a week, it would be demolished, taking many of its secrets with it to dust. But not all of them. Not anymore. The journals of White Cliff Orphanage had revealed a darkness beyond what I could have imagined when this investigation began. A conspiracy spanning generations, involving entities beyond human comprehension. And at the center of it all, children like Anna, selected, prepared, and traded to serve as vessels for ancient consciousnesses within human agendas. What happened in the days that followed our discovery in the subbase is a matter for another account. The distribution of the evidence, the careful approach to selected authorities, the inevitable confrontation with society members who had infiltrated the very institutions we turned to for justice. These events would test not only my resolve but my very understanding of reality. But that is where this particular record must end. If you are reading this account, it means the truth about White Cliff Orphanage and the Harrow Society has finally come to light. A truth documented in Journal number 31 with its fateful entry. We traded Anna yesterday. And perhaps somewhere in this world or beyond it, Anna and all the others who were taken may finally find some measure of peace.